Good evening, everybody. If you'll please take your seats, we'll get started for tonight. Hello, and welcome to the fourth and final lecture in our series with Dr. Stephen Berk. I'm Amy Posner. I'm chair of the Adult Ed Committee here at Agudath, and I'm happy to welcome you all tonight. I hope that you all, as I have, for those of you who have been here throughout the last 3 weeks, have enjoyed Dr. Berk's lectures. There's no doubt that he provides us with an insight and understanding that helps to deepen our perspective on the world, our Jewish place in it, what's going on today. So without any further of my talking, I will just ask you to silence your cell phones, please, and let's welcome Dr. Berk.
Good evening, my friends. Thank you all for coming. My friends out on Long Island, thank you for listening. Those who have come to hear me for 4 times, we're all Berked out. This will be the last time. And I wish you, if I don't see you again for some time, have a good and pleasant winter. Now, before I get into the subject, I must tell you about a very interesting thing that happened at Union yesterday. I was asked by the Rebbitzin of Chabad at Union, which is really a very important organization. I'm not a Chabadnik, I want to tell you that. No mechisa for me, but she has done an absolutely remarkable job. And she asked me some days ago if I would speak about Israel, give a sympathetic talk about Israel, which of course I would do, and I did do. We had about somewhere between 80 and 100 students, and it was something. It was really, I was prepared and I anticipated what was going to take place. One of the things that was so interesting and disturbing is how shaken our Jewish students were. Most of the students were Jewish, but there were some people of, let us say, Islamic background. And I gave the talk, and of course we opened it up to questions. And in the midst, in my talk, I was talking about Hamas, what the terrible atrocities that Hamas had carried out. And I said, there can be no defense of Hamas. And I also said that some of the rhetoric, because students have come to me showing me the emails, some of the rhetoric has been absolutely horrendous. And one of the most horrendous was it was posted, and the young woman, who may come from Niskuna, in fact. The young woman posted something in which she made reference to an earlier rally for Israel. And she wrote, those who attended the rally should burn in hell. Now, that's a very tough statement. It really is. So the students were shaken by that. And I was not, because I know that kind of stuff, that rhetoric is around. And then some of the questions came up, and from a handful of students, Alexandra Schmidt was there and Steve was there. I don't think it was more than a handful of students, but they raised some troubling questions and made some troubling statements. One of which was all of this stuff about Hamas atrocities, it's all Israeli propaganda, that's all it is. None of those terrible things had taken place. So it just was a very interesting thing, and it reaffirms something that I have thought about for quite some time, actually going back decades. Our Jewish kids, they go to the best suburban high schools or they go to the best private schools. They're coddled in those places. And then they come to a university or a college, they meet a number of Arab students. Now here's the parentheses. Everybody talks about diversity, and everybody wants foreign students, largely because they pay the freight. They come from well-to-do families abroad, and you don't have to give them any financial aid. The other side of that is, for students who come from the Middle East, they come with a political intellectual baggage whence they have come. And that is a problem. The difference, I tell you, I'm there in Union since 1967. So I've been there, I'm the old man of the mountains up there, or down at Union. And The graduates or alumni tell me, they say, how is Union now? Well, it's still a good place. Not the best, but it's a good place. And the difference is there are two substantial differences. I came in 1967 when Union was an all-male school. Now, of course, it's female, although Union is one of the few schools in the United States that still cannot bring up the number of female students to the number of male students, although we have desperately tried to do that. That may be a consequence of the heavy engineering and science program that we have at Union, but one doesn't know for sure. But it is a problem all across the country and in Canada as well. Men are not disappearing from university and college campuses, but their numbers are really reduced in a proportionate way. So these students come and they are going to, these students from foreign countries, or even those students who are native born, but whose parents come from the Middle Eastern countries. They come from they come with a hatred of Israel, not much liking for Jews and for Judaism. And this is what you get. And our students were very rattled by it. The other interesting thing in all of this was, and I never would have thought of it, I know my limitations. One of them is I'm a male. And I don't understand what really is so sensitive to female students and to females in general. When I spoke about Hamas, I mentioned that they had raped and they had mutilated, and I said, I worry about the hostages. I worry about particularly the women and the girls who have been taken hostage. The secretary of my department, or the administrative assistant, as we now call these people, a very nice woman, and a woman who is finely attuned. She has a good sense of what people are thinking. She was sitting up front, and she looked around as I was speaking, and I mentioned about the rapes and so on. And she said to me late this morning, she said, I'm not telling you what to say. You were right on the money in what you said. But when you mentioned rape, and I had mentioned it because I had to respond to what the students were saying in terms of the atrocities, when you mentioned rape, you are really striking a chord in many women and many girls. They don't like to hear it. They get shaken by it. And she also made this, she didn't make the statement, but we know it is true. We know it is true. And again, for a male, it's hard to factor this in. That is, a large number of women have been sexually assaulted or molested in one way or another. And I saw one girl was absolutely shaken because she started to cry. And I don't know, actually, the next time I give a talk on that subject, I'm going to have to watch what I say. On the one hand, I want to demonstrate how brutal Hamas is, and on the other hand, I don't want to shake everybody, any woman or girl to their core because of what I'm saying. So it just was an interesting thing. The most interesting thing, which testifies to the, how can I put this delicately, that is the not so good administration at Union College. That is, not only did this girl post this, they should burn, whoever went to that meeting should burn in hell, but I didn't mention her name. She proudly stood up and said, I'm the one who wrote it. Now, when I say about the administration at Union, the Vice President of Academic Affairs was there. She heard this. She's the number 2 person at Union, the second in command. She said nothing to reproach that young woman. Nothing. If you are watching on television or reading in the newspapers, you see there's a real variety of responses by college presidents and college administrators. Some have done the right thing, and some have said nothing. Some have said, have made puff statements. She didn't make, she said, it was a self-aggrandizing statement, saying that she'd once been a political science professor, that she taught Middle East politics. But at no point did she say what she should have said. That is unacceptable talk. We will not tolerate that at Union College. And she didn't say it. And that's the problem all over the country. All right. After saying, yes, I'm sorry, Lynn.
Do you think people are afraid to say something, to say that it's not acceptable?
I think they are. I think some of them are. And I must tell you, some of the statements, I think I mentioned this to you the last time. If I did, forgive me for being redundant. I'm there 56 years. There's 200 people on the faculty at Union. Because I'm there so long, I know all of them. I've been there longer than anybody else. Only 3 people out of the 200 ever came up to me and said they were sorry. Only 3 people, including 2 of them are in my department. That's a department of 12. I know these people for 35, in some cases 40 years. I'm highly visible. I don't expect much. You know, there are very different opinions on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. All they had to say was, I'm sorry, and they didn't do it. These are the times, if you have children or grandchildren that are in college or university at the present time, I can tell you it's a different world from the time that you and I went to school. We got to toughen our kids up, really toughen them up, because they are meeting something, again, everyone wants to believe in the marketplace of ideas, and you cannot restrict free speech or so on, but there's a limit. When somebody tells you you should burn in hell, that's a different thing. So you have the right. I would suggest to you that those of you, graduates of college and universities, look very carefully when you get alumni newsletters. See what the administrators have to say. Don't let them dodge it. Don't be afraid to speak out and to write. Now, Lynn, I got to say, who's sitting to your left? And you are? No, what is your name, if I may ask? All right, the only reason I'm asking, I thought you were someone else, and that someone else's daughter-in-law, who's a graduate of Union, called me today, and she also comes from Clifton Park. So, that's the only, I didn't mean to embarrass you. Forgive me, I just thought you were that. So, here we go. We're talking about Zionism and the creation of the State of Israel. Every century is important. Some centuries in the history of the Jewish people are more important than others. The 19th century is a very important one. It is the century of pogroms, and it is the century of a new type of anti-Semitism that goes beyond anything that existed before. The anti-Semitism that existed before was not really anti-Semitism. It was anti-Judaism, that is, hostility towards Judaism. And even in the worst of times, during pogroms earlier, in the medieval period, during the Crusades, Jews could save their lives by kissing the cross, that is, by converting or accepting Christianity. By the second half of the 19th century, this becomes impossible, absolutely impossible, because the new hostility to the Jews is based on pseudoscience, on social Darwinism, and the evil of the Jews, say the new anti-Semites, is not to be found in the Jewish Torah or the Jewish Talmud. It's in their blood. That is, or to put it another way, we would say in our time, it's in their genes, which means that no matter how much the Jews assimilate, no matter how much, even if they convert, the Jew has to be eliminated from the face of the earth. That's the new anti-Semitism. Put that together with the pogroms, and put a third factor, the rising of nationalism in Europe, one begins to see a number of Jews begin to think a number of things. The first one to say it, and everybody followed him, even though nobody read him, was this man, a German anarchist, actually, originally. This was Moses Hess. And Moses Hess, in the early 1860s, wrote a book called Rome and Jerusalem, in which he staked out what Pinsker, who I will talk about, and Theodor Herzl said. But Hess said it first, and that was, they hate our guts here in Europe. They will not let us live in Europe. We have got to get out. And Moses Hess said, again inspired by the nationalism of the time. You remember your high school and college history, the 1860s. Now here, we'll go to the side and I will tell you this. We Jews lament the fact that our kids know very, very little. I have a number of Italian students in class. When I mention Mazzini, Cavour, and Garibaldi, you know what they say? Who? These are Italian kids. They don't know anything. I teach a course on World War I, and I'm talking about, I go year by year, and I'm talking about 1916. And I talk about the great battles of Verdun and the Somme, and I said, what was important to the British was not only these battles, but what was going on in Ireland. So I turned to the Megans and the Heathers and the O'Rourkes and the Kellys, and I said, what happened in Ireland in 1916? What are you talking about? I say to them, did you ever hear of the Easter Rebellion? Never heard of it, Prof. Never heard of it. I'll use the inelegant language. Nobody knows nothing. It is a very basic fact of life here. So nobody read Moses Hess. And Hess said, inspired by nationalism, succinctly put, if the Italians can have Italy, this is the time of what in Italian is called the Risorgimento, the creation of a unified Italian state. If the Italians can have Italy, and Rome is their capital, why can't the Jews have the ancient homeland and Jerusalem as their capital? Now, nobody reads him. This is a time of assimilation by large numbers of German Jews. This is when, I've seen the graves actually, when a number of Jews who die, their families put on the grave, they take a new name. The most famous one, the ones you see in all the newspapers or in the magazines, is there's a grave of someone called Alfred Deutschland. That literally means Alfred Germany. Jews are taking German names, they're highly assimilated. To hear from a guy who says there's no future here, you got to get out, they won't pay attention to him. Comes the year 1881, April 15th, 1881. Now, to understand what's going to happen, one must understand the events of March 1st, 1881. On March 1st, 1881, Alexander II, the so-called Tsar Liberator, the one who emancipated the serfs, is killed by revolutionary assassins. This is an organization known in Russian as Narodная Volya, the people's will. If you ever get, when all of this is over, the war in Ukraine, if you ever get to what is now called again St. Petersburg, the guide will take you to what is a beautiful church called the Church of the Spilled Blood. That's the church that was really built on the site where Alexander II was murdered. One of the people in that group was a Jewish woman. She's not a major factor in the people's will, or Narodная Volya, but she is in there. Her name was Gesia Gelfman. In Russian, there's no H sound, so it would be Helfman. If you see a Helfman and they come from the old country, their name probably was originally Gelfman. For example, just as you don't say Hitler in Russian, you say Gitler. So there's Gesia Gelfman. She's among the revolutionaries. That's March 1st. April 15th, the first of a series of pogroms sweep over Russia. For those of you who can trace your antecedents to Eastern Europe and the Russian Empire, it's those pogroms that explain why you are here. That is, from 1881 to 1914, 1,500,000 Jews left the Russian Empire and came to our country. In addition to that, a wave of anti-Semitism swept over the Habsburg Empire, in Hungary, and especially in Romania. So another 500,000 Jews came. Between 1881, probably in 1920, we're talking about 2 million Jewish immigrants. So, this is the background, pogrom after pogrom. By 20th century standards, it doesn't look terrible. That is, a couple of hundred women raped, several hundred Jews killed, and a lot of destruction of property. But by 19th century standards, it's very, very important. In the city of Odessa, now called Odessa, in the city of Odessa, which had a very large Jewish population, maybe as many as between 30 and 40% of all of the people living in Odessa were Jewish. In Odessa lived a Russian Jewish physician, highly assimilated, not a religious man. This was Leon Pinsker, Pinsker. He is an assimilationist, believes that there's a future for the Jews in Russia up until the 1881 pogrom. This rocks him to his very core, and he wrote a book. The book is, to show you how assimilated he was, he wrote the book not in Russian, which he must have known, but he wrote it in German. The book is entitled Auto-Emancipation, which is going to say the same thing that Hess said, the same thing that Herzl was going to say. But there's a time and a place for everything. It's not the maximum time, but it is a time because of the pogroms. In the book, he says, once again, there's no future for us here. We've got to get out. And, because he's not a religious man, he's addressing the Jews. Auto-emancipation is, you got to do it by yourself. The Messiah is not going to do it for you. God is not going to do it for you. We've got to do it by ourselves. We got to get out of here. And he raises the issue of Palestine. He says we've got to create a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Some people listen to him. And in fact, in 1884, in the city, what in Polish is what we used to call Katowice, but which now in Poland is called Katowice, in Katowice he holds a conference, convenes a conference. And an organization is formed, Hibat Zion, which literally means the love of Zion. Hibat Zion, the love of Zion. And this organization will have, spread out throughout Russia, never very many, but spreads out through Russia, and its members become known as Hovevi Zion, the lovers of Zion. These are the people that are going to form some of the first settlements, there are very few of them, the first settlements within Palestine. This is, for want of a better expression, this is a proto-Zionist movement. Then we come to the man who, let us say, who meets the times. This is a very interesting man, a man with a lot of tsaros. He is a very smart man, a very capable man, a very highly assimilated man. This is a man, for example, who writes to someone who thinks a lot, writes to a friend, that I've got to go and buy a Christmas tree for the family. A very highly assimilated man. This is Theodor Herzl, born in the year 1860. Herzl, again, it's always a matter of debate among historians. When did he become a Zionist? Some say it's because of the Dreyfus affair. We'll talk about this in a moment. Others begin, he lost an older sister. The family comes from Budapest. He lost an older sister. If you ever get to Budapest, which is a beautiful city, if you ever get there and they take you, the guides take you to the Doheny synagogue, which I think is the most beautiful synagogue in the world, on the corner there's a Jewish museum, and that museum is built on Herzl's birthplace and where he lived for the first 13 years of his life. The family was so distraught by the loss of the daughter that they moved to Vienna. And in Vienna, Herzl goes to the university and encounters anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism in Vienna was very, very strong, despite the fact that there was not much in the way of physical violence. He goes to the university and finds out that Jewish students are being challenged to duels. And the Jewish students have to pay duel masters in order to defend themselves. He gets involved in a number of duels. Is this what moves him in the direction of being cognizant of anti-Semitism? It probably does. He then stakes out a career as a writer. He's a playwright, and he's a columnist. And he has a good deal of success in the leading newspaper of the Habsburg Empire, Jewish-owned and Jewish-edited. That's the Neue Freie Press, the new free press in Vienna. He is so good that he's assigned to Paris to be the Parisian correspondent of the Neue Freie Press. And he's coming in the early part of the 1890s, smack at the time of the first Dreyfus trial. Now, Alfred Dreyfus was an Alsatian Jew, and as a tribute to, against the French opening to the Jews, he probably occupied a position that was never occupied by any Jew anywhere at that time, including our own country. And that is, he is a member of the French General Staff, the Holy of Holies in the French army. You know what they used to say in France after the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 and 71? Every Frenchman goes to sleep, comforted by the fact that he knows that the lights never go out in the French General Staff, for they're planning the new war against Germany to recover the beloved lost provinces of Alsace and Lorraine. His family, together with lots of people, French Jews and non-Jews, left Alsace rather to be in France than under German occupation. Comes to France, prospers in France, again becomes a member of the French General Staff. The early 1893, the French have spies in the German embassy in Paris. One of the spies was a cleaning woman. She would go through, at 5 o'clock, when everybody left, she would go through the waste paper baskets and find out any information that might be helpful to the French General Staff. One day, she goes into the waste paper basket, and there's a letter from someone in the French General Staff asking for more money from the German attaché, military attaché to the German embassy in Paris, more money because I've given you certain secrets. She takes this piece of this document, takes it back to French intelligence, and they do handwriting expert. They look at the handwriting, and they come to the conclusion that it is none other than Alfred Dreyfus, the Alsatian Jew who has betrayed France. This is what sparks what comes to be known as the Dreyfus Affair. And they do the thing, they look at it, he is arrested, the very famous actor who started in the Yiddish theater. Now, I'm not sure all of you will know him. The only reason that I know him is because my father told me about him, because he saw him on the lower Broadway in the East Side. That was a man who became very famous as an American actor, a great American actor. That was Paul Muni. Some of you may be familiar with him. And what takes place is, of course, the first trial. Muni is there. Muni portrays it in the film The Dreyfus Affair. And it takes place in the French city of Rennes. And there's a very famous scene. He has been convicted in the court, and he's asked to give over his sword, and a French officer takes his sword and breaks it over his own knee. And poor Dreyfus is considered to be a traitor to France and is sent to rot in Devil's Island. And he would have rotted to death there if not for a number of things. Once, his wife was very loyal to him, more loyal than he deserved, incidentally. His wife was loyal to him. His brother was fiercely loyal. And then a writer that no one reads today, but if you took a good 19th century literature course, the name will mean something to you. That is Émile Zola, Z-O-L-A. Zola looks into this and is convinced that all of this is a tragedy, it's a farce, that this is an innocent man, and writes in a newspaper the famous letter, J'accuse, I accuse. It's open letter to the French president saying that an innocent man has been framed and he ought to be freed. Well, the proverbial is going to hit the fan in all of this. What is important for us is not how the Dreyfus Affair ends. It ends well. It does end well. Dreyfus will be exonerated. What is important is that in there is Theodor Herzl. Remember, again, you've got to put yourself back in time and place. For liberals all over Europe, all over the world, for Jews all over the world, 1789, the storming of the Bastille, the French Revolution, all of the emancipation edicts, all of these things signify that France is the home of decency and democracy. The Jews have done very well. Jews in the universities, Jews in medicine, Jews everywhere, Jews in the general staff. Herzl is so appalled by what he has seen, comes to the conclusion, if it can happen in France, it can happen anywhere. And then he comes to, this is 1894, 1895. In 1896, he writes the book the book that changes Jewish history and to a certain extent changes world history. In German, Der Judenstaat, the Jews' state. Not the Jewish state, the Jews' state, in which he lays out virtually everything that Pinsker and Hess had laid out. They hate our guts here. It's not only that they kill us, they may not kill us, but they will force us to abandon our ethnicity, our peoplehood, and our religion. So either we get out of here, and we don't get out of here, either we are going to die, or we'll be assimilated to the point that we'll be extinct. And he says, we got to get out of here, we got to do it ourselves. The same thing that the others had said. And he says, now whether this is true or not, you can debate, he says that we'll never command respect without a state. If the Jewish people don't have a state of their own, they'll be looked upon as wandering aliens. They can't find a home anywhere. Nobody wants them. We'll never command respect from humanity unless we have a Jewish state. What is interesting here is that he doesn't say where to go. He proposes a number of places. Maybe Argentina, maybe Australia, maybe Arizona, maybe the ancient homeland. In Western Europe, in France and Germany, very few people pay attention to him. This is the time, the triumph of liberalism. There may be anti-Semitism, but Jews are everywhere. Even in Germany, where there was a good deal of anti-Semitism, before 1933, there was no physical violence perpetrated against the German Jews since 1819. In 1819, there were a wave of riots all over Germanic Europe. So what I'm telling you is with the anti-Semitism in Germany, there was no physical attacks upon the Jews, and while some people argued for a reversal of emancipation, it never took place. And Jews did very well. It was much easier to be a professor as a Jew in a German university than it was to be a Jew in an American university as a professor. German Jews did very, very well. So they're not going to answer the call. But in Eastern Europe, the traditional Jewish heartland, this is going to resonate. They're under the pogroms. They're under the cold pogroms. Because in the aftermath of the pogroms of 1881 and 1882, quotas were placed upon Jewish entrance into the universities. The Jews, the overwhelming majority of Jews, still lived in the Pale of Settlement. There were pogroms there. No surprise that Jews would listen to Herzl. And Herzl looked the part. We Jews, we just kiss the ground that Gentiles walk on when it comes to political leaders. We just love them. When we see a Gentile support a Jewish cause, we fall in love with this man or woman. Sometimes, when Jews support Jewish causes, we don't pay that much attention to them. So Herzl looked the part. Well, he had a long beard, spoke very well, dressed immaculately, was able to meet with the Kaiser, met with the Sultan in Istanbul, met with the Pope in Rome. The Jews thought he was the best thing since sliced bread. And they respond to him. But when the Jews of Eastern Europe and the Russian Empire respond to Theodor Herzl, they, in effect, this is not the words of these people who listen to him, but this is the thrust of what they are saying. Herzl, you want to go to Arizona? See ya. You want to go to Argentina? See ya. We're only going to one place, the ancient homeland, Palestine. And so in 1897, Herzl convenes the first Zionist Congress in Basel in Switzerland. And what you should be thinking is, why? Why Basel of all places? He wants it in Munich or Berlin. You know why it's not in Munich or Berlin? The rabbis oppose it. Don't get upset what I'm about to tell you. Ready? Ready for me now? Gird your loins. The survival of the Jewish people is too important to leave to the rabbis. Just as Clemenceau said in World War I, the winning of the war is too important to leave to the generals. So what I'm telling you is the rabbis oppose it. Now remember, there's no middle ground in Germanic Europe as far as Judaism is concerned. The bulk of the community is Orthodox, but a surging community is what we would call Reform, but what they call liberal Judaism. The Orthodox position, which even some Orthodox Jews continue to adhere to, is that only God in his infinite wisdom and in his timing will send the Messiah, and the Messiah will lead the Jews to a Jewish homeland. Any movement on the name of Zionism is, of course, forcing the hand of God. You know where those people live? In Bnei Berk and Mir Sharim, in Jerusalem and outside of Tel Aviv. That's where they live. These are the people by the hundreds of thousands. These are the so-called Haredim. These are the people that think that Zionism is an abomination. In our country, the group that thinks that way is that small group that always on Israel Independence Day protests against the existence of the State of Israel, and some of their rabbis go to Tehran and meet with the government of Iran, castigating Israel. This is the group of the Neturei Kata, the guardians of the gate. So Orthodox rabbis reject Zionism, and the liberal rabbis reject Zionism on the grounds talking about a Jewish homeland, talking about Jewish peoplehood. That's contrary to what we want. We want to be assimilated. And your talk of a Jewish people wanting to go back to the ancient homeland undermines our demands for emancipation and undermines our desire to be equal with all of the Germans. They will think that we are disloyal. That's why the first Zionist Congress does not take place in Munich or Berlin, but takes place in the relatively small city of Basel. There, the Jews from Eastern Europe gather, and they begin to decide what we're going to do. They establish various organizations. The Jewish National Fund, for example, is one of those organizations. A fundraising apparatus to buy land to help Jews settle. The Zionist movement is often running, and it is in 1897 at that first Zionist Congress that Theodor Herzl makes one of the great predictions of modern history. He says 50 years from now, there will be a Jewish state. The famous statement translated from the Hebrew into the English is, and you see it in the Knesset, if you will it, it is no dream. If we work hard, we can do it. This is Herzlian Zionism. This is the birth of political Zionism. And Herzl's vision of a Jewish state is Germany. A highly efficient state, a modernized technocracy, for example, a state where the Jews will get along, everybody will respect them. And in the book that he writes, the one novel that he writes, Das Alt Neuland, the Old New Land, he asks the question that very few Zionists asked. He's an honest man. He had traveled to Palestine. Now, to show you how naive some of the first Zionists were, here's one of the dumbest statements ever made by a Zionist. The dumbest statement. Fortunately for the Zionist movement, he leaves the Zionist movement. But many Jews, many Zionists, continue to believe what he said. Here's the statement. The people without a land is going to a land without a people. Do you understand what that means? The people without a land is going to a land without a people. The stupidity of that statement is that when it was made, there were 500,000 Arabs living in Palestine and less than 50,000 Jews. That man was a fool. But Herzl was no fool. Herzl had been there. And Herzl addresses himself in Das Alt Neuland to this basic issue. The issue, of course, that bedevils Israel down to the present time. The relationship between Jews and Arabs. Ever the optimist, he has in the novel, presumably a man modeled on himself, a German Jewish correspondent who comes to Palestine to see what's going on there. And in the novel, the Jewish correspondent meets with an Arab sheikh, a leader of an Arab community. And the Jewish correspondent asks the Arab sheikh, what do you think about all these Jews coming here? And the Arab sheikh responds, now these are not the actual words, we think it's great. And the incredulous Jewish correspondent says, why? And listen to the answer. It's all true. It's all true. Jewish OBGYNs come to Palestine, and they make sure that our women do not die in childbirth. Jewish ophthalmologists come, and they make sure that our people do not suffer from the eye disease trachoma. Jewish engineers come, they drain the swamps of the disease of malaria. and Jewish businessmen come, they build an industrial infrastructure that employs both Arabs and Jews. It's all true. It's all true. That's exactly what happened. What Herzl did not understand, and what some Zionists, most Zionists did not understand, and some don't understand it down to the present day. I'll use a cliche metaphor. The Zionist movement accepted, that is, the idea that the Arabs would trade their birthright for a better tasting bowl of porridge or cereal. What we have learned is that nationalism is the most powerful of ideologies, and to expect the Arabs to accept the idea that they would give up the land that they considered to be their land to the Jews was foolish. Now, it's easy for me to say that in 2023. Now we know it's not true. But the Zionist movement actually believed that it would be true. Even Ben-Gurion believed it to be true until the early 1940s. The only one who saw that it wasn't going to be true is the most controversial Zionist of them all. Again, I know where I'm standing, so I'll watch the language. For those who hated him, he was a fascist, a disgrace to the Jewish people. For those who liked him, he was the great prophet, Jewish prophet of the 20th century, and a man who understood reality. That was Vladimir Jabotinsky. Jabotinsky said, they hate our guts here. They will never agree to our settlement here. The only way they will be able to survive here is we build an iron wall around the Yishuv, the Jewish community in Palestine, arm ourselves to the teeth, and when the Arabs come against them and we beat them back, the day will come and then they will realize we have a right to have a place here. Herzl and most Zionists did not believe that. But Herzl is the man that translated an idea into a political movement. And that is very, very significant. This is the man without whom there would not be a Jewish state. Another good example of the role of personality in history. The problem, of course, for Herzl is history or life always intrudes in our personal lives and in our collective lives. April 1903, the worst pogrom in the modern history of the Jewish people, up until the Russian Civil War when the Ukrainians carried out their pogroms against Jews. Up until from 1648, down probably to April of 1903, this is the worst of the pogroms. This is the famous or infamous Kishinev pogrom. Number of Jewish women raped, lots of property, 86 Jews dead. That's what we know of. This is going to change things. It really is going to change things. Herzl is rocked. His soul is rocked by the Kishinev pogrom. So rocked that he is willing to abandon the idea of going to the Jewish homeland, at least temporarily. He says what we need is, Dan, you'll correct my German, what we need is a Nachtestill, a place for the night. We need a place for the night. And his famous expression is, where a Jewish mother can go to sleep at night, comforted by the fact or reassured that no one will stick a pitchfork through a child's brain. That's the way it is put. And because he feels for the Jews of Eastern Europe, because the pictures are horrendous about what has been done to the Jews, he begins to negotiate with the British foreign minister, who may not have been a Philo-Semite. Remember what they used to say about England? That old saying which I drum into my students? England has no ally. England has no eternal allies. England has no eternal enemies. England only has eternal interests. What the British want is a white population in their African colonies. And what the British foreign minister offers Herzl, I can't give you Palestine. Palestine belongs to the Ottoman Empire. I can give you part of this territory that we have, a colonial territory, the area known as Uganda. Take Uganda. And Herzl says he personally will take Uganda. We need a place where the people can really go to sleep at night. Whether they could go to sleep at night in Uganda, who would know that? But Uganda looks better than a Palestine that they cannot get, and in Eastern Europe where they are. This is the famous Uganda crisis. within the history of the Zionist movement, probably the worst crisis of them all. The result is going to be, he proposes that they take Uganda as a temporary solution. It's fought out in a Zionist Congress, and the East European Jews prevail. They're the ones under the gun, but they say only the ancient homeland. Herzl has to agree, and then tragedy. Heart attack, 1904, he's dead at the age of 44 years old. The Zionist movement was bereft of its greatest leader, its most important leader. So there we are. Herzl has set the machine in motion, created a Zionist movement. It has a fundraising apparatus. They're going to, let us say, buy land in Palestine, and they begin to settle in the land. Remember, 1881 to, let us say, 1894 is the period of the first Aliyah. Then you get into the second Aliyah, and we are talking about what came to be an irrevocable reality, the creation of the Yishuv, the Jewish settlement within Palestine. And if you want to spin this out a little bit longer, it is, what do we do in the Zionist movement now that Herzl is gone? The man that now takes the helm is, I think I asked you this once before. If I say that Chaim Weizmann was the second greatest lobbyist in Jewish history, who was the first? When I ask my students, they'll tell me, maybe some people even think that now, President Biden. Who's the greatest lobbyist in Jewish history? Golda. I'm sorry? Golda. No, I mean not Golda, not Golda. Are you ready for me now? Here's what I do with the students. I give them three choices. I'll say President Biden, and the kids will say, no, 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 no. I say, let's say, David Harris, the President of the Union. That surely is not true. And then I say to this kid, it's Moses. And the kid thinks for a while, says, yeah, Prof, I think you're right. And I tell him he's got a future. So, Moses is the greatest. Remember, after the golden calf, God wants to destroy the people. Tells him, I'm going to choose another people. And Moses lobbies, and the Hebrews are not destroyed. But Weizmann is now the leader, and he's a lobbyist. It's Weizmann who says, we will do it, not the way Herzl wanted, not by negotiations with the political leaders. We will do it dunam by dunam. A dunam is a sixth of an acre. We'll buy the land, sixth of an acre, dunam by dunam, cow by cow, goat by goat, sheep by sheep, and person by person. We'll do it the slow way, but that's the way we're going to get there. And Chaim Weizmann is the one, of course, a lobbyist. I think I may have said this to you before. When I was in Hebrew school, you know what they taught me? And they may have taught your kids as well, but I don't think so. We're more sophisticated now. Chaim Weizmann was a good chemist, a very significant chemist. But because he was a Jew who had come from Eastern Europe and settled in Manchester, he could never get a professor's position. He never got above the rank of a lecturer. But in World War I, he developed a method of creating synthetic acetone, which is very important in explosives, very important for the British war effort. So what they told me in Hebrew school was, the British said to Chaim, Chaim, look what you did for us, what can we do for you? And Chaim Weizmann said, I want a Jewish homeland, and they said, you got it. Well, that's not the way it worked. It's not the way it worked. The way was that because of his contributions to the British war effort, no one could turn him down with a meeting. He had entree into everybody's office, including the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Lloyd George, and of course its foreign minister, who had once been a prime minister, Arthur Balfour. And he did his lobbying skills. He lived a long life, and I must tell you, when is the last time he used his lobbying skills? You should all know this, because since I'm talking to mature people, not the people who believe in history that begins in 2008, when was the last time he used his great lobbying skills, and with whom did he use it? Because we want to finish before Shavuos, I will give you the answer, and the answer is Harry Truman. It's Weizmann that meets with Harry Truman. Now, how important the lobbying effort is, that's a matter of debate. If you want to read a good book, a very good book which discusses this issue among other issues, It's the book, The Ark of the Covenant, by Walter Russell Mead, a very good writer, very good, in which he argues this, in which he makes more money than you ever wanted to know. It's not Weizmann who really turns Truman around. It's Eleanor Roosevelt. She's the one that turns Truman around to accept the idea of a Jewish state in Palestine. But that's for another lecture. Suffice it to say here, Herzl is the man that changed history. Herzl created the movement. The movement is off and running. And one of the people who is attracted to the Zionist movement is the most prominent Jew, the most famous Jew in the United States of America at that period of time. The first Jew that gets a Supreme Court appointment. That is Louis Brandeis. Brandeis is a towering figure, an absolutely towering figure in American legal history, in American labor history. He settles the strikes on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. This is a great man, and this is a man that becomes the leader of the American Zionist movement. So Herzl is the man that sets everything in motion. We started with Moses Hess, we came through Leon Pinsker, and now there is, of course, Louis Brandeis. Now, the last book, if I remember correctly from looking at this, is a book that no one would call great literature, and that is the book Exodus by Leon Uris. It is a great read. It was a good film, a little slow-moving at times, but it was a good film. It is a fictional account of what took place with that ship, the Exodus. Here is the true story about the Exodus. About 4,500 Jews were placed on a boat. That's a boat that was given to the British in the Second World War, the USS Warfield. The Zionists put 4,500 Jews on it, and they give it the title Exodus. And the Exodus sails. The British intercepted outside of Tel Aviv. They won't let it land. And they won't even intern the Jews, as they had done with some Jews, put them on the island of Cyprus. There were British detention camps in Cyprus that throughout the Second World War, Jews were sent of the British intercepted ships that were taking them to Palestine. So the real story is the ship is sent back. It never makes it to Palestine. It never makes it. That's not what the film says. The real stories not only are to show you how tough the British are, not only will they not allow the ship to go back to Palestine, they'll send the ship back to France, where the Jews are then placed in the DP camps, the displaced person camps, whence they had come, and on German soil. These are Holocaust survivors now who are sent back to German DP camps. The British were very, very tough. Now, the reason for the British being tough was a certain amount of anti-Semitism in high places in Great Britain, very polite anti-Semitism, no pogroms ever in Britain since 1190. So the Jews, there's anti-Semitism, and remember what I told you in an earlier lecture. The British have no eternal enemies, no eternal allies, they have eternal interests. The British will continue to cater, even to pander, to the Arab population, the Arab majority in Palestine, and the close to 40 million Arabs that live in countries around Palestine. They do not want to jettison the support from the Arabs, and they do not want to get into a shooting war with the Arabs, as they had done in Palestine in 1936 to 1939. So the British continue to implement the White Paper of May 1939, which strictly limited Jewish immigration into Palestine. It's only after the creation of the State of Israel in 1948 that these people are allowed into Palestine. That's the true story of the Exodus. The fictional story is a very interesting one. The ship again sails, it's boarded by the Brits, there's fighting, which in fact did take place, a number of Jews are killed, some commit suicide, but eventually it becomes an international scandal for the Brits. It's very embarrassing for the British to have the ship loaded with Jewish survivors of the Holocaust wandering around, and eventually, again, as I said to you, they will eventually be brought back. That is, in the book, not in the real story, but in the book, the Jews make it to Palestine. Now, there's some very interesting things here. In some ways, the book is a good book. It is Zionist propaganda. There's no question about that. This is the book that raises Zionist consciousness all over the world. But it's an interesting take in some ways, a number of things here. First of all, it discusses the British hostility towards the Jews. That's a fact of life. And it will play itself out in 47 and 1948. And then you remember the star there, the fictional star, of course, the real star is Paul Newman. He plays Ari Ben Canaan. And he's got a father and an uncle. And that is a very interesting, that's probably the most valid historical part of the book. The father, Ari's father, was a member of the Haganah. He was relatively moderate. This is a man that believed, as Chaim Weizmann believed at the time, and David Ben-Gurion believed at the time. It'll all work out. We will negotiate with the British, and surely after the war, they will come to our assistance and help us create a Jewish state. And those who believe that, like Chaim Weizmann in particular, believe if it doesn't work and the British government doesn't respond, then we'll appeal over the heads of the British government, go to the decency, intrinsic decency of the British public, and they will support the creation of a Jewish state. And if that doesn't work, we will go to the President of the United States, and he will help create a Jewish state. But as you should know, if you have even the most cursory knowledge of Zionism, there were other people in Jewish Palestine who said, it isn't ever going to work. We got to do it by ourselves, and the only way to do it by ourselves is to make the British pay a blood price. The two organizations that supported this were, one, the Egun Tzvai Lumi, the national military organization led by Menachem Begin, and then a very, very strange group of people, very controversial. If you like them, they're called the Stern Group. If you don't like them, they're called the Stern Gang. They're a tough bunch. Now, to show you how tough they are and how strange they are, everybody believes that a British victory will ensure the survival of the Jewish people. You got to support the Brits. That's why over 30,000 Jewish men and women joined the British Armed Forces during the Second World War. Now, I may have mentioned this to you before. If you didn't hear it before, you can put this in Trivial Pursuit. The next time you go to a bar mitzvah or a Jewish wedding, what songs do they play? Hava Nagila, all right. They play one of the few songs on a 78 record where it was number one and on the other side was number one on the same record. The one side, the first side, was Goodnight Irene. The other one is the one they sing at Jewish functions, Tzenet Tzena. Tzenet Tzena was number one on the 78, and so was Goodnight Irene. You should also know that the song Tzenet Tzena is a recruiting song in Jewish Palestine. If you look at the words in English, it's see the soldier, how handsome he looks, and so on. It's a recruiting sign for Jews, particularly Jewish men, to join the British Armed Forces in the Second World War. And that is important because when the crunch comes in 48, the Jews have technological skills. They have been trained under the British, which gives them an enormous advantage in 47 and 48. So, with all of this, again, the book talks about the conflict. If you want to see how the conflict is played out in another work of fiction, it is in film. Not only in Exodus, but there are a number of films that deal with this. And there are a number of books. I suspect that everyone in this room has read, or you should have read it, Elie Wiesel's book, Night. Everybody reads Night. It's not the best Holocaust story, incidentally. The best book on the Holocaust by a survivor of the Holocaust is Primo Levi's book, Survival in Auschwitz. That's the emes. You never know whether Elie Wiesel is telling the truth. Now, he's not a liar, but he's letting his imagination roam. Primo Levi tells you exactly the way it was. This Italian Jewish chemist who spent time, a number of years, in Auschwitz. So, everybody reads Night, but he wrote another novel called Dawn, D-A-W-N, which is a very interesting story. Dawn, the British have arrested a number of Sternists and Irgunists. They are going to hang them at dawn. The Irgun has captured a 21-year-old second lieutenant, British second lieutenant. They've got him in an apartment somewhere in Tel Aviv. They put him in the apartment, and in charge of them is an 18-year-old Holocaust survivor, Jewish survivor. He is given the orders by the Irgun to turn on the radio at dawn. And if he hears that the British have executed these Irgunists and Sternists, he's to put a bullet in the back of the neck of the young British lieutenant. I won't tell you what happens. You can read the book in 2 hours. It's a very easy read. So that's played out in Exodus. Because Ari Ben Kanan's father, he is more moderate. He wants to negotiate with the British and believes that through negotiation, it will take place. A Jewish state will come. His uncle, that is Ari's uncle, is a man who belongs to an organization called the Maccabees. That's really the Irgun or the Stern group, the Maccabees. That to show you again how I told you before, and I moved on too quickly, the Sternists did not believe the British are the key to Jewish survival. You know who the key to Jewish survival is, they said? The Nazis. We should negotiate with the Nazis. They have the Jews. So we can fight the British, and maybe we can make a deal with the Nazis to release large numbers of Jews. It was crazy thinking. Absolutely crazy thinking, but that's what they believed. But they were also terrorists. These are the people that send the first letter bombs. And in November of 1944, a group of Sternists make their way to Cairo. And they assassinate the British High Commissioner for the Middle East, Lord Moyne. So that's the struggle, again, that's played out here. And it gets played out when the war is over. This is the thing that Zionists don't like to talk about. And I consider myself Zionist. But Israelis, because this is a difficult period. This is what is known, late 45, early 46. This is the time that is known as the season. The British are cracking down. Men like Ari's father they want to negotiate. The Irgun and the Stern Group want to make the British pay a blood price. Ben Gurion does something that will haunt him in some Jewish eyes, some Israeli eyes, really to this period of time. Ben Gurion gives the order to the Haganah, and the shock troops of the Haganah, the Palmach, the creme de la creme of the Haganah, round up Sternists and Irgunists. Either turn them over to the British or incarcerate them in secret prisons. There are 2 civil wars going on in Palestine, between the Jews and the Arabs, and between the Jews and the Jews. And you get a sense of that in what I'm talking about. Now, in addition to that, these are some of the themes. That's why it's a good read. Even today, it's a good read. It's Zionut. That's the pejorative term that the Israelis use for Zionist propaganda. But it's good propaganda. Why shouldn't you read it? It's good stuff. Now, the book will eventually be translated when the Refusnik movement begins in Russia. This book is going to have an impact upon Jewish thinking in the Soviet Union. In Russian, it's Ishod. Ishod is the Russian word for Exodus. And when it is published, it's never published officially in Russia. It is produced by what in Russian is called samizdat, self-publication, on typewriters or by hand. You circulate it. The interesting thing here is, these Russian Jews, or Soviet Jews who are so highly assimilated, when they make their 48-page version of the Exodus in the form of Ishod, they leave out a character. You know the character they leave out, if you remember the film and the book? They leave out Kitty. Kitty is the Gentile woman, the blonde woman, very attractive, who falls in love with Ari. He's left out in the Soviet version. They don't want to hear any talk about intermarriage. But it is an important book. It tells you some of the mindset of some of the Jews living in the Soviet Union. And then the impact upon American Jewry. Exodus Zionizes American Jews, and American Jews Zionize American society. Remember, we're talking about the post-war period. 560,000 Jews served in the armed forces of the United States, probably a higher percentage of the Jewish community than for American society at large. Some of them were great heroes. The Jews now have a certain amount of self-confidence that they didn't have before. And Hollywood and American society addresses the issue of anti-Semitism. Life magazine publishes the pictures of Dachau. There are all sorts of testimony. The Nuremberg trials are going on. And Hollywood finally decides, with all of the alleged Jewish control over Hollywood, in the interwar period, there are no films that deal with anti-Semitism. There are films that are anti-Nazi, films that are anti-fascist, but not one of those Jewish producers and directors will make a film that deals with the issue of anti-Semitism. But when the war is over, it is a different time and a different thing in Hollywood. In Hollywood, in 2 years, 2 very good films really appear. One of them, I suspect you all know, and you saw it one time. It may not be the best film, but it has an enormous impact. That is Gentleman's Agreement with Gregory Peck. That's the film that condemns the Gentiles, condemn anti-Semitism. You see anti-Semitism in the advertising industry. If you haven't seen it, it's a good period piece. The other film is also a good one, and it had some publicity, but it didn't get the same publicity as Gentleman's Agreement. It's a film called Crossfire, which is set in San Francisco in a bar, really sometime in 1945. Sitting at the bar is a guy in civilian clothing. A group of Marines come in, and they start talking. And they find out somehow that he's a Jew. And they start taunting him. Well, you didn't serve in the war, They didn't give him a chance to speak. He actually did serve. He was a Marine. And had served, I think, at Iwo Jima. But they don't give him a chance to talk. And they start saying the usual stuff. While we were getting our gullions shot off, you were playing around with our women. All that stuff. And the sergeant is a nasty guy, and they kill the Jew. They kill this guy. And a good actor, not as good as Gregory Peck, but if you're dated, you'll know who I'm talking about. That's Robert Young. Robert Young is a detective from the San Francisco police, and he solves the murder and deals with all of these people. You see the limits of Hollywood in that film, Crossfire. Because in the original script, the man sitting at the bar is killed not because he's a Jew, but because he was a homosexual. Hollywood would not deal with that for another 50 to 60 years. But anti-Semitism is now kosher. You can now talk about it. And in effect, what you can say is, if you're an anti-Semite, you're spitting on the graves of our soldiers who fought to defeat the Nazis. All the barriers come down. The Mohawk Club barriers come down here. The residential covenants come to an end here. The quotas in the schools, well, you got to be careful with that. At Union College, the Jewish quota doesn't end until 1965. But the trajectory is in the right direction, which means now that Jews can rally, as they never have rallied in this country, to the Zionist cause. They're not afraid anymore to give political, vocal, and financial support to the Zionist movement. Ben-Gurion sends to the United States, around 1948, the woman who used to be called Golda Meyerson, she's what we know as Golda Meir. He says, go to the Americans and get $5 million. She comes back with $50 million. The American Jewish community has responded to the war, to the Holocaust, and of course, to Leon Uris's book, Exodus. So here we have the last chapter of our sessions. We went through anti-Semitism, we went through Russian Jewry, went through a whole host of things, we went through the Haskalah, and now we have come to the greatest Jewish revolution of them all, the creation of the first and only Jewish state in the last 2,000 years. My friends, that's it. The floor is open. Where are we here? Oh, we are late. So, hang in there tough. I'll get you out by 9 o'clock. Are there any questions on anything that I have said, anything in the 4 lectures, anything on the books, anything about what's happening at Union, anything you want to know, to the best of my ability?
It seems like we're back in the early 40s right now. What's going on in schools, what's going on in the world. Can you comment on that?
All right. You know, are we back in the 30s? You know, after the 73 war, a man was interviewed, a father in Israel, Jewish father in Israel. His son had been killed in the war. He himself was a Holocaust survivor. He said, of course, I grieve for my son. But he died with a gun in his hand. Not like it was during the Holocaust. He died with a gun in his hand. There is now a Jewish state, beleaguered though it may be, there's now a Jewish state that can defend itself and can defend the interests of the Jewish people everywhere. So it is a bad time for us. This is a very, very bad time. But it's not like it was in the 30s and 40s. Israel can defend itself, of course, with American help. And I must tell you, we can talk, we know each other now, and some of you I know very, very well. I voted for President Biden in 2020. I could not possibly vote for Donald Trump. But I was not a strong supporter of President Biden. And for some time in his tenure here, I was not terribly supportive. But he has acted magnificently. He has just really, he has done what we have always wanted to do from our leaders. And again, what we did not get at Union College. And that is, you want, when Jews are under attack, you want the leaders of a country, the influence makers and shakers, you want them to speak out to condemn anti-Semitism and to come to the defense of Jews. We can take care of ourselves, but it's always better when we have support in high places. And President Biden has done that. What the future will bring, I do not know. The pressures upon him, particularly from the left wing of the Democratic Party, are just great. And what worries me about that, these are the people in what is called the squad. I worry about them. I know my Democratic friends who are more zealous Democrats than I am. You know, I told you the old thing there. If you come from Brooklyn, you have to be a Democrat. There's a gene, my doctor friends here know. They didn't learn what I'm telling them in medical. They never learned in medical school what I'm telling them, but I'm telling you it's the truth. On chromosome 16, there's a gene that codes for the Democratic Party. You just can't. But there are zealous Democrats and the not so zealous Democrats. The zealous Democrats tell me, don't worry about the left wing of the Democratic Party, the squad. Don't worry, they are contained. They're only a small minority. All of that is true. But look who our champions are in the Democratic Party. They're good people. Chuck Schumer is a good man. Steny Hoyer is a good man. And whatever you may think of Nancy Pelosi, she was always in our corner. You know what the problem with them is? They're fossils like me. That's what they are. They're old. And not one of the people in the squad, I think, is over the age of 38. The most dangerous of them is the one who is the smartest. That's AOC. She's very smart. She watches her language, but she's no friend of ours. Watch out for her. I may not be around when that time comes, but the time will come when she will run for the Senate in New York State. Watch out for her. All right, so in direct answer to your question, it's not the 1930s, it's not the 1940s, but it's not a good time. Yes, Murray.
You were gracious enough to lend me your book, The Ark of the Covenant. In it, all of us will need really comes to a conclusion that the rise of nationalism and religious fervor, both in Europe and the United States, caused some muted support for the creation of the Jewish state. Have you seen anywhere else that kind of conclusion?
That the anti-Semitism led to support for a Jewish state?
The support of Zionism creation
From whom? From Americans? Yeah, it was there. But the interesting thing that we talked about at dinner was here you get an example. There's an example of how something looks to be terrible, and it was terrible, but it had a silver lining. That is, at the end of World War I, there were people who worried about what our country is going to be. And a number of writers began to speak, and they got an audience in Congress and among the American people. What made America great? White Anglo-Saxon Protestants, the argument was. They the ones that made America great. And our country is going into a decline because of Slavs, Italians, Jews, and black people. What you got to do is restrict immigration. So for the first time in American history, there was a real crunch on immigration. Before World War I, close to 2 million Jews, that's not right, 2 million people were coming into the United States. According to the Jackson-Reed immigration law of 1924, we are coming close to closing the gates quantitatively and qualitatively. In various amendments, no more than 168,000 people would be allowed to enter the United States. And we don't want people, there's nothing against, doesn't say anything about Jews. We don't want people from Eastern Europe. We don't want Italians. We don't want the Chinese. We don't want the Japanese. And we don't want people from Africa. That was a catastrophe for us. It means that lots of people who could have been saved during the Holocaust will not be saved. The silver lining is that when Jews were asked in Eastern Europe where they wanted to go, 95% of them said, we want to go to the United States. But under the gun in Eastern Europe, if you can't go to the United States and everybody else is closing their gates, you go to Palestine. And what Walter Russell Mead was saying is, without Jackson-Reed, there may not have been a Jewish state. That if we had open borders, or let us say, not so restrictive immigration, hundreds of thousands of Jews would have come from Eastern Europe. They would not have gone to Palestine. They would not have created that critical mass in Palestine that was essential for the creation of the State of Israel. It's an interesting take. Anything else, my friends? Anybody want to say anything? Yes, Natalie.
What do you think is going to happen with Gaza?
What do I think is going to happen with Gaza? No, Natalie Oceans and I go back a long, long time. Her husband was a wonderful man, a wonderful man. So, Natalie, why have you asked me that difficult question, Natalie? We're all friends. Now, but that is the question of the day. That is the question of the day. You read the editorials about it, you read all of these things. The honest answer is, damned if I know. Now, the problem for confronting the Israelis is, first of all, the most important problem is, how do you get the hostages out? Now, in order to get the hostages out, the Israelis are going to have to go into Gaza. Unless there is something that we do not know about, that negotiations are going on, and it's possible. The Israelis they're killing a number of Hamas people. They've taken some Hamas prisoners. Maybe, just maybe, some sort of exchange could take place. It's possible. But barring that, it's going to be the worst type of warfare. And that is, you don't have to be a military specialist. The worst type of warfare is street to street, house to house, knife to knife. It will cost the Israelis anywhere between 300 and 600 dead to take Gaza, to get the hostages if they're still alive, to root out Hamas. But then, that's your question. What do you do once you do that? Do you hold on to Gaza? Well, the Israelis held Gaza. You hold on to Gaza, it'll cost you probably 20 to 30 Israeli lives each year because there will be people who kill Israelis in Gaza. It means that Israel has to bear the burden of feeding these people, taking care of them, all that has to be done. The Israelis don't want to do that. So a possible solution is you have the UN take it. Given the behavior of the UN in relation to Israel, I would suspect that the Israelis would not like that very, very much. Here's one of those ironies of history. You see, history is filled with ironies. The United States is Israel's greatest ally, politically, financially, militarily. You know who the second greatest ally is? It's Germany. Germany is Israel's second greatest ally. The Germany that killed 6 million of our people is the only other country out of the United States that will provide Israel with the SAR, what we would call a PT boat, or the submarines. They all come from Germany. So, who you going to allow the UN there? Well, some people say the Turks. Well, the Turks could do the job if they wanted to, but with President Erdogan, who has really manifested anti-Semitic, this is an understatement, anti-Semitic tendencies, I wouldn't like the Turkish army there. And let me tell you, you don't want American soldiers in Gaza. You don't want them there. When that solution is offered, reject it. Reject it. Because Americans, if they patrol Gaza, some of them will die, and you could bet your last buck that there will be people in our country who will say, look, the Jews are bringing about the deaths of Americans. You do not want American soldiers there. Are there other people, other countries, a UN body? All right. The optimal solution is the one that will not take place. The optimal solution is there are 2.5 million people there. You distribute them among Islamic countries throughout the world. And Gaza becomes a non-place. But that is not going to happen. The Arab world will not agree to it because they have always used the refugees as a pawn against Israel. They will not agree to it. So either Israel occupies the area or it goes to somewhere else. But in the short run, the Israelis have got to get those hostages out. And every day that is delayed, if you are a religious person and pray, you pray for the people, those hostages, particularly for the women and girls. That's who you should pray for. Every day that goes by, these hostages are in hell. So the Israelis will try to get them out, probably with some American support, but it is going to be a very, very tough slog. Anything else? Yes?
My mother was from Vienna.
Right.
A Holocaust survivor, got out from kinder transport. She always said that she, on her 16th birthday, was Kristallnacht.
I'm sorry?
November 9th.
Yeah, Kristallnacht, yes.
She said the Jews of Vienna in those days were completely assimilated into the country. And by hook or by crook, she was able to come to this country.
Right.
My grandparents also escaped the whole other way. My mother always said, however, and she loved America because America saved her. However, she said, we never thought anything like that could happen in Vienna. She never experienced anti-Semitism there. My question to you is, what can we do about the rising anti-Semitism here, now especially with what's going on in the world?
You know, she's asking the question, what can we do about anti-Semitism in America? That's what you're essentially asking. What one can do is you fight, we live in a marketplace of ideas. You fight anti-Semitism with the ideas that counter anti-Semitism. That anti-Semitism is contrary to the best of American values. You also say to people, there's no panacea here. Whatever I'm saying is not going to solve the problem. Again, I think I may have mentioned this to you before. I'll paraphrase Plato. Plato said, only the dead have seen the last of war. Only dead Jews have seen the last of anti-Semitism. It will always be here. So one becomes an emissary for the state of Israel. One does not take, for want of a better cliche, anti-Semitism lying down. You fight it wherever it is, and you bring to the attention of our compatriots that historically anti-Semitism never ends with the Jews. There are other groups that will come under attack. And an anti-Semitic government will be a repressive government in relation to everybody, black or white, Jew or Gentile. All will suffer under an anti-Semitic government. The cliche expression is that we Jews are the canary in the mine. That when you see the canary die, you get the hell out of the mine as quickly as you can. So we are the canary in the mine. The other thing, we have the right to demand of our politicians. And we have been successful, actually. You get some idiots, like Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, but they're, again, for the moment, isolated in the party. And that brilliant model citizen, Marjorie Taylor Greene, she too is isolated within the Republican Party. We have the right, and it is imperative for us, to demand of those of our elected officials, right down to the county and the municipal level, that they do not endorse anti-Semitism in any possible way. That's what you can do. More than that, in a democratic society, in a marketplace of ideas, there's very, very little that you can do. Also, I'm sorry to say that we have got to defend ourselves, not only verbally, but physically as well. The synagogue, Roberta and I spent part of the year in Florida. That synagogue where we are, in Boynton Beach, that synagogue has 2 fully armed guards, and these guys seem to know what they're doing about. That's what you got to do. In these times, that's what you have to do. But, my friends, this is the greatest country in the world. We will endure. We will not only survive, we will thrive. Things may get a little nasty for us in the short run, but I am among those. My wife says I'm a pessimist. Well, among other things, but not about the survival of the Jewish people and not about the survival of Israel. If the Israelis do what they have always done, fight with resilience and tenacity and skill, and if the American Jewish community does what it has always done, supply Israel with financial and political and military support, then this you can take to the bank. 50 years from now, there'll be a state of Israel that will say and ask the American Jewish community, Am Yisrael Chai? And the American Jewish community will respond, the Jewish people are still alive. Thank you all. Have a good winter.
Thank you all again for coming tonight. Please watch your emails for all the other interesting and engaging programming that Agudat Achim Adult Education is bringing your way. And have a very good evening. And Am Yisrael Chai.